Good evening, everyone. I'm really pleased that you've taken the time to connect with us today to talk about a topic that is becoming more relevant than ever at a time where we're increasingly looking for ways to be fulfilled at work. I'm just going to ask the participants to mute their microphones. Okay, there you go. Thank you so much. Um, so we're going to be talking about a topic that is becoming more relevant because we're increasingly looking for ways to be fulfilled at work, but also in our lives. And we're finally resorting to coaching or training on topics that are related to our mental well-being and the enhancement of our soft skills in general. I'll be your speaker for this webinar. My name is Soufiane Alaoui. I'm a former investment banker and a private equity manager. And at some point in my career, I felt that I didn't belong in the environment that I had conformed to over time. So instead, I started following my passion by setting up a coaching practice in early 2020, which today has grown to see the addition of online trainings that have reached over 1,000 students. So let's cut to the chase. Today's webinar will first include a 30 to 40 minutes presentation on the topic of well-being at work with an emphasis on emotional intelligence, which is a field that may seem quite mystical to some, but I wish to break it down into something very pragmatic and easy enough for you to understand. So in addition to the concepts, I'll include a great deal of examples that will help you actually relate to what I'll explain. I'll also share a few tools that you can use to better manage your feelings, and we'll finish everything with a Q&A session of around 20 to 30 minutes. So I'd like to start things off by asking you a simple question. And if you want to, whenever I do that, you can answer me in the chat. Do you share the idea that the way you think has an impact on your life, on your relationships, or on your mood right now? Uh, Yeah, of course it does, right? So let's imagine that for some time you liked your job for a reason or another, but one day you wake up tired from what happened the day before, from a few days where you pulled long hours in the office, from dealing with a client that you find hard to handle, from having problems with your managers or your subordinates that you perceive as a waste of time, from doing the same things over and over again without finding any real meaning to it, except that you have a job that pays your bills. You wake up telling yourself that you're going to spend a bad day at the office, but you must go there because it's an obligation. So you actually drag yourself to work, and this obligation turns into a burden. And you actually end up having a long and frustrating day. You kind of work against your will, and you do your best to tolerate everything that triggers your discomfort. But of course, you repress those negative feelings because there's a mortgage on the house, you need to pay for your kids' education, or maybe your priorities are elsewhere. You've stayed in the same company for the past 5 years and you're eyeing that management position. I don't know, like maybe that new SUV that that you would want to buy. Whatever the reasons are that have you enduring what you are going through. But your problems start when you know that you won't change your working environment anytime soon. And well, since the same causes eventually produces the same effects, well, the same thoughts will eventually strengthen your perception that things are not okay. So the next day, the next week, or even the next month, it gets worse. The behaviors of those around you become more and more unbearable. You keep doing the same thing over and over in your job, and it ends up actually weighing on you until you feel that you can't take it anymore. And next to you, you may have a colleague who has more or less the same workload as you do, the same responsibilities, and yet he manages his daily life a little better. He's not affected by the stress of his deliverables, nor by the way in which he deals with his clients or with the management. So the basic idea that I want to convey here is your perception of a situation is your own. It's singular and it's the result of what you've integrated through your education, your social conditioning, basically your whole experience as a whole. And if you're not careful enough, if you don't understand that everything that happens inside of you is an indicator of the quality of your thoughts, if you don't express how you feel, or if you're still skeptical about emotional intelligence, well, you could believe that you're healthy and well adjusted because some of your relationships are kind of smooth, for instance, but they still annoy you on a deeper level. But it's now proven that repressing your emotions is correlated with a higher blood pressure, higher heart rate, an immune deficiency, difficulty sleeping, a lack of fulfillment in life, or as suggested by the psycho-oncologist Dr. Temoshok, a higher incidence of cancer. Okay, moving on. I've got another question for you, and it's, do you think that you control your behaviors somehow? Okay, well, basically, okay, yes, okay. So let's say if you're a smoker, you may have decided one day that you were going to quit, but you still didn't manage to do it. Or you're trying to become a little more self-disciplined in order to advance your personal endeavors or your professional projects. But instead, you keep binge watching your favorite TV shows. You go out for a drink whenever you get the chance. You go out shopping, spend your time on social networks. You can see yourself as being calm sometimes, but as soon as you get angry, you lose control and you say aggressive things that you end up regretting. So what I'm trying to say here is that we do a lot of things that we don't fully understand all the time. What it means is that the way in which we behave contains more information than we know or understand. And one of the psychoanalytic theories would tell you that you're the sum of several sub-personalities, where each would be partially autonomous. Each would have its own motivations, its own rationality, and where your emotions act in the background to kind of influence your behaviors. When you're scared, you're going to avoid taking initiatives. When you get angry, you raise your voice without caring what the other person has to say. When you're sad, you shut down and you want to isolate yourself. So our behaviors would be a consequence of the way we feel. And look no further than the health crisis that we're going through to see how these feelings affect us. With the pandemic and the lockdown, as economists would say, all things being equal, some people focused their attention on the instability of their position at work and started nurturing a sense of insecurity and an anxiety that had them push themselves more than they ever did before. And they put a pressure on themselves that kind of suffocated them. Others who really wanted to change jobs or just go on vacations saw their options become completely limited overnight, which ended up fueling their frustration. And guess what? If you don't know how to manage your frustration, you start showing up late, become demotivated and less productive, and so on. And there were others who kind of always see the glass half full, no matter what, who perceived it as an opportunity to establish a daily routine that balanced their personal and professional lives, and those who explored new options to launch their business. So you may wonder, what exactly triggers my feelings? And by the way, if you don't really know if you're feeling something or not, I'll ask you that in a more simplistic way, although it doesn't do emotional awareness any justice. But what are you complaining about? Usually, the first reason that comes to mind is a circumstance, a situation that is outside of us. It's the lockdown. It's my boss who gave me too much work. It's the economy that's down. It's what my husband or my wife told me the other day that I didn't like. But it's simply not the case. What I was trying to show you with the previous examples is that your circumstances don't necessarily trigger your feelings, because for the same circumstance, our way of perceiving it and the emotions that we feel for it is different from one person to another. So it's impossible that a circumstance alone can justify what is happening inside of you. And you can understand that by looking at not only how others react differently for the same situation, but also by looking at how you yourself could have different reactions depending on your mood. Uh, Say you have a little kid. Say he makes a little noise. He's getting playful and agitated one day when you're on a vacation or on a weekend. You're not bothered, and you just let him do his thing while thinking to yourself, well, he's healthy, and that's normal for a kid his age to be full of energy. Now, imagine that he imagine that he's just as playful or agitated when you come back from a stressful day at work. And off you go. You lose your temper. You start yelling at him while believing that he's the one being irritating. But really, you're the one who lacks patience and who have no control over what goes on inside of you. And all of that happens at the expense of your kid. So when you externalize the reason that justifies your behaviors, that is to say, when you be, when you believe that others make you behave in a poor way, you set yourself as a victim and you will never recognize your own inappropriate behaviors. And if you take this reasoning just a little bit further, you're really one thought away from justifying verbal, emotional, or even physical abuse. Why? Because it's your fault that I yelled at you. It's your fault that I said something inappropriate or hurtful. It's your fault that I treated you badly. And I think that understanding this nuance makes a major difference between, say, a tyrannical manager and a leader who could eventually be empathetic. So, to sum it up, your perception of what is happening to you, your interpretation is at the basis of what you feel. And if you're still not convinced, I have a question that I often ask my clients, which is this. It's, if anyone tells you something that makes you feel angry, stressed, guilty, or sad, then who really controls what goes on inside of you? And at this point, if you're still looking for reasons outside of yourself, uh, if uh, uh, if you still believe that others are triggering that inside of yourself, then you're either under somebody else's influence, or maybe you have anger management issues and you don't want to improve. But all in all, you can't tell the difference between a fact and a feeling. When you think deeply about this question, do you realize how we externalize the reasons that cause our own internal discomfort, which in turn leads us to having a reaction that translates the little objectivity and hindsight that we have towards what we experience, how we fail to tell a fact, like someone telling you something disrespectful, having 3 projects to finish for the end of the week, the way your boss tries to micromanage you, from a feeling like frustration, anxiety, stress. And this is where your problem actually lies. It's with the way you feel towards the fact, not the fact itself. Aaron Beck, the founding father of cognitive behavioral therapy, introduced this eye-opening model to better understand how we react to our reality. So, under the influence of your perception, your circumstances will generate an idea, which will have you feel an emotion. Okay, there you go. Which in turn often gives rise to a behavior with little to no added value. And the sum of your ideas, your emotions, and your behaviors, well, it's simply your personality. We'll get back to this idea in more detail later on, but your circumstances are not always the problem. However, they reveal you to yourself and show you that you have parts of yourself that you don't fully control, where an emotion you don't quite understand ends up provoking a harmful behavior that you don't change nonetheless. And that's what makes you complain about your boss behind his back, be jealous and get in the way of someone else, be greedy and try by all means to surpass others financially, even if it means to be deceitful at work, to need to assert your authority by denigrating the work of your subordinates and to always put pressure on them. And I'm sure that we can extend this list on and on with many more things. But instead, I'll invite you to try and identify what you are doing that you know deep down is wrong to others or for yourself. And well, if nothing comes to mind, then chances are that you're narcissistic or you're a saint, who knows? But I hope you'll allow me to be a little doubtful here. In any case, no one has ever come to me or to one of my sessions to tell me, Sufyan, I'm perfect in every aspect of my life and I really don't see how I could improve. By the way, Nietzsche used to say that it's impossible to suffer without making someone pay for it, and that every complaint already contains revenge. However, blame is emotional discomfort translated into some kind of a verbal diarrhea, with the underlying idea that you don't behave in a way that makes me feel good, or my environment isn't in line with what I'd want to feel satisfied because I don't have the right salary, the right job, the right whatever makes you feel that way. But no matter how much fault you find with another or with your current situation, and regardless of how much you blame them, it will not change you. The only thing that blame does is to keep the focus off of yourself when you're looking for external reasons to justify your unhappiness or your frustration. And sure, you may succeed in making someone else feel guilty about something by blaming them, put them on the defensive, or you may gain somebody's sympathy by having them feel sorry for what you go through. But you won't succeed in changing whatever it is about you that is making you unhappy, which eventually becomes detrimental to to your relationships or your life in general. But here's the thing, you don't always get to choose your circumstances. You choose how you react to them. But wait, if your reactions are your own doing, then it means that you've always done what you want. And sure, what you've obtained so far may not be completely aligned with what you wish for, but you're the one responsible for keeping things the way they are, especially if it triggers a discomfort inside of you. Because at the end of the day, you're not taking any initiative that would make you take a different path from the one that you've always been on. And this is really hard to hear for people who are in what I would call toxic or tyrannical relationships, who willingly comply or abide by what the other person asks. And they do that because there's a certain outcome that they're looking for, which could be validation, appreciation, financial compensation, which has become more important than their integrity, their honesty, or their well-being. But they continue to put up with that. They continue to actually put up with what happens, because by going around complaining about how much work they have, how poorly they're treated, but they don't explore any other alternative and maintain their that posture, because they've never learned to try and become more than what they are today. Uh, I can't remember where I heard that expression, but experience is what you get when you don't get what you want. Good. Let's do a quick summary of what we've established so far. So our perception is our own. It determines the ideas we have about a situation or a circumstance. These ideas influence our feelings, and these feelings can make us react in a way that is not always productive. I hope you're beginning to notice that my questions are aimed at having you question yourself a little deeper every time. But do you believe that you control your thoughts? Okay, everyone, do you believe that that you control your thoughts? Rather, I have within me the ability to assert myself and review some of the conditions that I find abusive. Those very thoughts would allow me to try and stand up for myself, try to influence my circumstances so that I can set healthier boundaries. And if they don't change despite my initiative to have others respect my well-being a little more, then I'm probably not in the right place. You can't force yourself to accept what is beyond some of your boundaries, because either you accept a situation and you feel harmony with yourself and with your environment, or you think you have no choice and you have to accept it because that's the way it is. But in that case, you'll end up repressing your stress, your anger, and other negative emotions because you comply to certain things that are not okay. But the worst part is you do it voluntarily. Now, there's this guy that I really like, the late Dr. Wayne Dyer. He used to talk about this analogy, which is you can't die from a snake bite. Once you're bitten, you're bitten. So what kills you isn't the bite itself, but it's the venom that runs through your veins. And I love this analogy because you can replace the snake with a circumstance that you don't like, somebody who says something that bothers you, a workload that you find too stressful, an idea about yourself that makes you feel guilty, like, oh, I shouldn't have done this or that. Or maybe you feel unworthy in thinking that you're not able to do something in line with your aspirations or what you believe your potential to be. What you should know is every idea that you have that triggers your negative emotions end up impacting your endocrine system, which eventually determines the hormonal balance of your body. For example, each idea that triggers your anger acts as a small detonator that release catecholamines that put us at risk of cardiovascular diseases. The response that we have when we're stressed has been described by the physician Hans Selye, who introduced the notion of general adaptation syndrome, which unfolds in 3 phases. When you're exposed to a stressful situation, to a stressor, your body enters what is called the alarm phase that triggers a physiological process called the fight or flight response, which makes your body produce adrenaline. Now, it's not unusual that stressful setups are a structural problem in certain jobs, and they keep on going for a while. And in that case, we get into the resistant phase because basically the body cannot permanently remain on alert. And it's at this point that you will get used to the stress. You get used to pulling all-nighters or delivering on shorter and shorter deadlines. And that's when we start to live by the hormone of stress called cortisol. And eventually this hormone leads us to what we call the exhaustion phase, which generally leads to a suppression of the immune responses, hypertension, depression, or burnout. Now, depression or exposure to sadness for a long period of time ends up decreasing your levels of dopamine and serotonin, which are basically the hormones of pleasure or fulfillment, and increase your levels of melatonin, which is also known as the sleep hormone. And that's why when you're depressed, not only you don't want to do anything, but nothing really makes you happier anymore. So getting back to our analogy, your ideas act like a bite. And if you're not careful enough and you maintain the negative feelings that they trigger inside of you, your emotions and therefore the hormones that they release will eventually get the better of you. So in a sense, you can make the case that your negative emotions act like poison. So basically what we're saying here is that the way you think can literally make you sick. And if you have a tiny bit of common sense, you understand now how important it is to pay attention to the way you think. That's why we come to a point where it's useful to identify the kind of ideas that trigger negative emotions, either at work or in our relationships. Starting with anger. Anger is usually the expression of our frustration. It arises when there is a deviation between reality and our expectation. Say, for instance, when you don't get the raise you expected. So deviation between what I expect and what happens in reality. This triggers my anger, this deviation. But where do you think the problem lies? In my expectations or in reality? You see, we keep getting back to this distinction between fact and emotion. But for example, if someone doesn't reply to a message you sent them and you get angry with no regard whatsoever to their circumstances that caused the delay in their response, then where's really the problem? When you find yourself stuck in traffic, for those of you who live in a packed city, is the problem really the traffic? Or is it your inability to be patient and finally accept that it's a structural problem and that either honking or becoming furious at anyone else won't change anything? The psychologist Albert Ellis, founder of the rational emotional behavioral therapy, would have told you that it's because of irrational ideas that you have internalized, that have become automatic and that completely shape your perception of reality. Those ideas can induce inside of you a low tolerance to frustration. And one of these ideas would be something along the lines of, life must be easy, things must happen exactly the way I want them to, others have to treat me exactly the way I want them to, or else they're no good. Now, if you were spoiled by your parents when you were younger, well, going into adulthood, you internalize this nasty idea that you're owed pretty much everything. So today, your tantrums will look like something like blaming, yelling, over criticizing, voluntarily withholding affection from your partner to punish him or her in some way until he or she matches your expectations again. That is to say, until he or she does exactly what you want him to in order to feel good. And if uh, if your partner is someone who needs your affection to feel good about him or about herself, uh, you're quickly going to end up in a toxic pattern. But that's a topic for another day that I cover in depth in one of my trainings. Okay, so of course, sometimes our expectations are not the problem, because there are circumstances where it's actually justified to be angry, especially in situations where we're treated unfairly, given little recognition, treated with little or no consideration at all for the way we feel when we're threatened or feel powerless. For example, if your manager promised you a raise for your increased efforts because the company was understaffed and didn't want to recruit anyone, but they didn't deliver in the end, eventually you'll be angry. You'll lose your trust and motivation to work there. You'll show up late at the office to display your satisfaction. You will pretend to agree with some guidelines without actually implementing them. You will start to gossip behind your manager's back. I mean, there's no end to the passive aggressive behaviors we could engage in. And I mean, it's pretty mind boggling to inflict that upon yourself, because no matter what actually triggers your anger, whether if it's a biased or irrational expectation, a real injustice, a lack of respect, or whatever it is, your anger is your self-inflicted punishment for circumstances that don't depend on your control, your voluntary conscious control. And this implies that you've externalized your well-being and conditioned it by the realization of circumstances that do not depend on you. Our stress, our fears mean that there is a gap between the perception of a threat, the requirements of a given situation whose outcome is uncertain, which could be something like speaking in public or in front of a committee, wanting to set up your own business, a deliverable for a big project, maybe even the aggressive behaviors of your partner that you wish to avoid, and the resources you think you can use to face them. So basically, the level of stress that you feel simply reflects the gap between the demands of your environment or your circumstances and your ability to overcome them, or rather, the perception of what your abilities are. So just like with anger, we still have that duality that prompts us to ask ourselves, where is the problem that actually triggers my anxiety? Is it whatever I tell myself about my abilities, about who I am, about what I can do, or is it the expectations of my environment? And again, both options are worth considering. If your deliverables require 15 to 16 hours of work a day for a week, then obviously you're going to be stressed. Now, if much more reasonable or attainable goals are causing you anxiety, then don't you think it's high time you looked at what you're telling yourself about what you can achieve? Because your fear in those instances only point towards one thing, the fact that you believe that you are not enough. If I think that others won't like me or that they will reject me, then I will be afraid of their judgment and I will withdraw myself from social interactions. I won't try to meet new people. Um, if I think that what I say is not smart enough or not valuable enough, or that my ideas at work won't be appreciated, then I will be afraid to put them forward in a meeting. If I think that I don't know how to adapt to new situations, then I'll be scared of undertaking a new project or accept a new position that entails more responsibilities. If I think that any initiative that I could take won't work out for me, I'll remain passive and anxious, and I won't try anything different, even if I'm in a job or a relationship that makes me feel miserable. I'm sorry. I'd like to make the case that there are no stressful situations, only thoughts that make them stressful. You see, we keep coming back again to this distinction between facts and emotions, because if deep down I knew deep down inside of me that what is still uncertain would work out, if I was sure that everything would be okay, would my circumstances still be stressful? What do you think about that? If you knew for certain that everything would work out for you, would you be stressed? Okay, so of course not. So what it means is that anxiety, stress, or fear is the meeting point between an uncertain outcome and an unconscious inclination to feel weak about myself that reminds me that who I am today will not be able to get what I want, that I will not be able to control my circumstances so that they match exactly what I think I want. And I eventually become a prisoner of the outcome that I have in mind that I absolutely want to see materialize. And so I will have a hard time tolerating what failure is by my own estimation, because I haven't been taught to see it as a lesson. Instead, I think that failure is something terrible. And one reason for that is that I have correlated my self-esteem to my personal achievements, to what I get, to the position that I hold in my company, to the money I earn, to the appreciation and validation that other people show me. And the problem with this last need is that I care more about my image than I do about my personality. I care more about my reputation than I do about my character. So discussing those topics is actually the perfect introduction to another nasty emotion if we don't really understand it and how it works. And that last emotion is unworthiness. And our late friend Albert Ellis, if you do remember this previous slide, which who put forward the idea that we have other irrational expectations that influence our perception of a given situation. The first one being that we need to be perfect and we need to succeed or else we are no good. For instance, if your education was predicated upon receiving praise when you were successful, that is to say, if your parents displayed affection or showed appreciation only when you had good grades and punished you whenever you failed, then eventually from then on, you start believing that you absolutely need to succeed to be validated and feel good. Now, hear me out. It's perfectly healthy to want to succeed in your endeavors, but it becomes a problem when you turn it into a need. And just recently, one of my clients was finally able to see how his thought process was predicated upon the idea that predicated upon that very idea that he needed to succeed at any cost. And in turn, he had become a workaholic, not because he loved his job, but because he felt that he lacked something, that he was trying too hard to make up for unconscious feelings of anxiety and unworthiness with external accomplishments. And I mean, that's still socially fine in the sense that he wasn't hurting anybody in the process. But if you lack ethics or a moral compass, you may even treat others poorly in trying to get what you want, and you will never find fulfillment in your relationships. If you become hard on yourself as you strive to become an achiever, to gain recognition, to be better than others, starting with trying to have better grades, then getting into a better university, then having a higher salary, then moving up the company ladder as fast as you possibly can, uh, having a better social status, a better car, a better life, then you'll always suffer from this moral sickness called more or not enough. And you will be motivated not by what you love, but by what you lack. And that's like the story of the donkey with a stick on his back holding a carrot in front of him. He'll never be able to get it. You'll do everything by pressuring yourself to achieve a well-being that is conditioned by obtaining one more thing, that one more thing, just that thing that will supposedly get you there. Okay, so a second idea that we internalize is I must win others' approval or else I am no good. So people who have internalized this belief have an unconscious fear about what others might think of them, and they want to be seen under a positive light. To that end, they will align their behaviors with what others expect of them. They will agree to what others say or think because they wouldn't want to be rejected if they voiced a different opinion, if they said no, for instance. And so they're more concerned with how others perceive them and ultimately compromise their integrity and sometimes their well-being in order to be validated by others. Generally, people who had very opinionated parents who expressed themselves in a guilt-inducing way, well, those people were constantly told how they should be, how they should act, how they should express themselves, what they should believe in. And eventually, they had to conform to what their parents expected in order to gain their affection. And later on in life, they usually become people pleasers because they end up making their well-being dependent upon the validation of others. You will recognize yourself here if you think that you're making a lot of efforts in your job, in your relationship, if you think that you're doing everything to be well perceived, that you're trying hard to have smooth and conflict-free relationships, that you're not saying anything to upset others because you don't want them to get angry or to make a judgment. Basically, you're trying at all costs not to be rejected. And if that's the case, you might think that you're being nice, that you're doing all this because, well, that's how it goes in relationships or in the workplace, doesn't it? You have to make sacrifices or efforts to make it work, right? Well, I'm here to tell you that if you're in this situation and believe you're gentle, well, think again, because in reality, you're harmless. And it's easy to hide your fear of honestly speaking your mind or setting healthier boundaries, of basically being fully yourself behind this smooth or perfect persona. But you're only fooling yourself because this type of profile ends up nurturing a lot of resentment for others because you end up attracting people who will take advantage of what you do for them without giving you the recognition for you hope for, who will treat you in a way that doesn't suit you, but that you will put up with because you need them to show you either signs of affection or a validation, or you think that you absolutely need to be perfect in their eyes. And unfortunately, you'll end up in what is called a codependent relationship. And in my sessions, I often ask my clients a question that acts like a wake-up call for those people when they're in a toxic relationship or in a toxic job environment. And that's, would you recommend your relationship to someone you love? And usually everything that they've tolerated that suffocates them starts to resurface. Because if the answer is no, you may wonder what has become so important, what outcome has become so valuable for me to tolerate all the unhealthy or destructive patterns that I've noticed the other engaged in. Okay, one last summary of what we have seen so far. I'm just going to take a little sip of water. So, okay, so the perception of your experience is conditioned by ideas that you may not be paying attention to. These ideas influence your feelings, which end up conditioning your behaviors. Your emotional discomfort is noticeable because it affects your physiology, and if you leave it unchecked, it can ultimately harm you. But it can be mitigated by understanding one thing: the fact that your emotions are healthy, but the way in which you express them may not be. Your emotions are healthy because they're trying to inform you that something in your life is not contributing to your well-being. And instead of always thinking that the problem is located exclusively in your external environment or your circumstances, it may very well be in the way in which you react to your environment that doesn't allow you to solve what you perceive as a problem. So these reactions may be deeply rooted inside of you, and you do not change them because of a number of fears or irrational expectations uh, that you've internalized. However, your reactions are your own doing because they depend on factors that are under your control, namely your ideas and your feelings. So if you have the same problems with the same circumstances or the same people and hope that they will change by having the same perception or the same reactions, you're simply fooling yourself by staying in a comfort zone, which is nothing more than an unsatisfying but familiar place that you've grown accustomed to, because there's an outcome in staying there that somehow gives you a sense of security or something that you find useful somehow. But don't worry, we all get caught up by the guilt of our lack of initiative in one way or another, because we all have a voice that reminds us that we're not all that we could be, and we know it. So, okay, I don't know about you, but we're probably at a point where you're wondering, how can I react differently? How can I control my anger, better manage my stress, or overcome my fears? So if you're impulsive with your anger and you become confrontational by raising your voice, and becoming hostile, then I would recommend the stop method with 2 Ps, which basically says you should be stepping away from the situation that triggered your anger for a few minutes. Take a deep breath until you can feel yourself calming down, because otherwise you're very likely to say something that you will regret. And if you do express your anger aggressively, what you're really saying deep down is, the way I feel and how I express it matters more to me than our relationship or the quality of our communication. I've already talked a lot, I know, and I'd like to leave some time for your questions. Without getting into the specifics of conflict management, the way in which you communicate when you're angry makes a world of difference. Instead of listening to reply, trying to be right at any cost, becoming defensive when you can't win the argument, because that's what anger is. It's, I want to impose my point of view and you're going to hear me out until I feel satisfied. Instead of all of that, you should listen to understand and be constructive. You should learn to disagree without becoming disagreeable. And most importantly, learn to become assertive instead of being aggressive, so you can set healthy boundaries when you need to. So you want to avoid all patterns of verbal abuse: no blaming, judging, threatening, being condescending, moralizing, labeling the other person, implying that the other had bad intentions, and so on. Finally, learn to give constructive feedback. And there are a few guidelines for that. Okay, so these are, first of all, you want to be completely factual. Make the feedback about the other's behavior, not about who they are or about their personality. So you want to avoid saying sentences starting with "you are," this or that. Instead, you want to share the way you feel. It's pretty counterintuitive, but talk about the other by starting your sentences with I statements, with I. And when you do that, you will see how they won't become defensive anymore. So you want to learn to make the difference between you're selfish and only think about your own well-being versus I don't feel considered and I resent you when you don't include me in the plans you make, for instance. In the workplace, if you're a manager, you want to stay away from your presentations are mediocre lately and they're a testament to your newfound lack of motivation, which is nothing like, on your latest presentation, we're going to stick to the facts. I don't see the usual graphs and analysis you used to present me, and I feel like you don't have the same level of commitment lately. Is everything okay? You see the difference? All right, next up is stress. If you're stressed because of a lack of organization, I'll invite you to check out the Eisenhower decision matrix to learn how to prioritize your tasks by urgency and importance. But to overcome your real fears, those that prevent you from actually taking initiatives, like speaking in public, approaching new people, setting up your own business, I want to share with you a technique that I discovered in cognitive behavioral therapy, which is called exposure therapy. Basically, the goals you have that you feel are not attainable are like some kind of an ideal that crushes you because they seem too distant and they trigger a fear that you have not identified yet. So instead of arguing for your limitations, you want to name your fears, whether it be judgment, failure, conflict, the fear of not being perfect, and so on. Once you know what actually scares you, the goal in exposure therapy is you want to gradually and voluntarily expose yourself to your triggers. So what you want to do is you must first structure a plan in which you will deconstruct your goal into micro objectives. So the idea here is when you define your micro objective, you want to put yourself in a situation where you feel uncomfortable, but not discouraged, where you feel that what you will do isn't something that you're used to, but it's something that you'll be able to somehow manage. For instance, if you're terrified of talking to strangers, then what you can do is have a setup where you're with 2 friends and one other person you don't know. Then the next time, have only one of them around. The next time, go for it alone when you feel that you can model yourself after what sociable people can do and what you can do on your own. So gradually practice until you can achieve what you want. Okay, I think I should probably stop. So we can talk about how to deal with sadness or guilt if you have any questions on the topic. But I will conclude the first part of this workshop by saying this. If you're not fulfilled in life, then your emotions are trying to tell you something. If you're looking to escape from your daily life, your dreadful job, or your complicated relationships by thinking that you will be fine, only when you can go out for a drink, when you can enjoy yourself, when you go on a weekend, on a holiday, when you find yourself in front of the TV at night, when you use any kind of substance to numb yourself from actually knowing what you truly feel, then you will remain in a cycle where you'll always be looking for a temporary gratification to forget structural problems that you refuse to deal with by staying in a false comfort zone while thinking that the next job, the next vacation, the next relationship will make you feel good, but you'll never really be fulfilled until you understand what it is about yourself that caused you to feel that way. And in the same way that you don't get burned simply by talking about fire, you don't really understand emotional intelligence just by learning theories or principles that you could easily find on the internet today, which is why I wanted this webinar to be a little more than that. Now, everything that you've learned so far, all the knowledge of what's external to you, you can forget. But what you have understood about yourself, what you become, you can never not be. Okay. So thank you all for your attention and for attending this event that I hope is in line with your expectations. I'm already looking forward to taking your questions. After the end of this workshop, I will share with you an insightful ebook that I hand out to my clients in our first session. It will help you figure out in depth where you stand in your life and the kind of goals you should set for yourself. And finally, with the coupon Life Balance 25, you will receive an exclusive 25% discount on all of my trainings that have already satisfied over 1,000 students. I'll be taking your questions now.